Hey everyone, I just wanted to give a very quick disclaimer before the episode starts that this interview was recorded in early January of 2020. So if you're wondering why when we're talking about online learning, we do not at all mention COVID-19, that's why. Now there's still a lot of great content in here that is relevant to CS education, and I hope you enjoy listening to this episode. Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this episode, I interview Anne Gunn. Anne is an instructor at the community college in Sheridan County, Wyoming. She also works with some of the school districts in the local area to help them with CS integration in the classroom. In our conversation, we discuss Anne's background as both a CS professional and as an educator, some of Anne's thoughts on data analysis for classroom integration, some implications of understanding computer science as a skill rather than just a topic, our experiences helping develop the Wyoming Computer Science Standards, as well as a range of other topics that are of interest to CSK8 educators. Now, you may notice that my voice sounds a little different. That's because I am recovering from a sinus infection, and you'll actually hear it in this interview because it was literally recorded a few hours before I got pretty sick. So my apologies that my voice is a little out of it for this recording. Before we get started, just a friendly reminder that you can find the show notes at jaredoleary.com, and there should be a link in the description for the show notes for you to go directly to the show notes for this episode, where I include a bunch of resources that Anne and I discuss. And with that, let's begin with Anne introducing herself.
So my name's Anne Gunn, and I am currently an instructor at Sheridan College, which is one of the two campuses of the Northern Wyoming Community College District. I teach computer science, programming, and web development online, essentially 100% online, although I have some classes that meet once a week in a hybrid format. Sheridan County in Wyoming is a bit unique because we have these remarkable philanthropic organizations that try to take active roles in various aspects of the community. And one of them decided a few years ago that they really wanted to support computer science education. So they've funded my position at Sheridan College as both an additional instructor of computer science and as a liaison to the school districts. So I have this appointment where my time is split basically 50-50 between teaching college students, community college students, and mentoring primarily high school and middle school teachers and the students. So I get to actually spend time in a classroom with high school students, even though all of my college students are online. And that helps with the sanity quite a bit because teaching solely online is a really difficult task, just as learning online is a difficult task.
So if I remember correctly, you were a CS professional and you switched over into CS education. I was wondering if you could share the story of how you got into computer science education.
I've essentially always worked in the software industry. The first half of my career, I was in the business side of software, doing tech support, sales, that kind of thing. The second half of my career, I promoted myself to an entry-level programmer and became more and more technical and wrote software for a living. And now in the third half of my career, which I always intended to have, I'm teaching programming to others. This really was always my intention in some vague way. When we moved from New England, where we were living, to Wyoming, and we had to choose a community, the deal was we would go someplace small enough for my husband, but large enough to have some kind of college, so there'd be some hope of being able to teach computer science eventually. So 3 years ago, I went from being a freelance programmer full-time to being what I am now, which is an instructor and school district liaison full-time, with a little bit of software development work still as a freelancer on the side.
Sounds like you have a really interesting balance between working with a wide range of people and in different things.
Being able to get in a classroom and work with students is really a pleasure for me. I'm very grateful to the high school computer science teachers who let me walk in and do the fun, easy part, which is figure out why the code's not working and try to explain obscure things to students without having to do any of the classroom management or grading. It's just a huge privilege, and probably the most fun I have all week is those few hours I spend with the high school students.
Yeah, and you refer to debugging as like the fun part of coding, and I feel the same way. Like it's like this fun like problem trying to solve, but I know a lot of people are very frustrated with it. And as we've kind of talked in person in the past, like debugging is one of those things where even if you don't want to do it, you're going to do it.
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, how do you frame debugging as a fun thing for people who are kind of hesitant about it or are afraid of it?
That's a really good question. It's interesting. We had a conversation with one of the math instructors. So I work very closely with a colleague, Mark Toney. And so we are together teaching computer science at Sheridan College. And we had this chance hallway conversation with one of the math teachers the other day, and she was talking about a student and saying, oh well, he'll take cosine 1010 in the spring, and then he can take this other class in the fall. And we were saying, well, yeah, but he's got to get through cosine 1010 before he can, count on taking this other class. And she said, oh, well, he's in Calc 2. I mean, he's smart. He can do anything. And we both had this reaction like, hit the pause button. Why is that statement wrong? Why is that assumption that somebody who's smart is also going to be good at coding? And I finally came up with the fact. I was thinking about a student I have who is in exactly that same situation. He's in Calc 2 as a freshman at college. He's super smart. The difference is he wants to be right.
Mm,
He always wants to know the right answer and do things the right way, and he gets really frustrated when things don't work.
hmm
And one of the chief aspects of enjoying coding is that you have to enjoy solving mysteries, and you have to take some sort of weird pleasure in figuring out why you were wrong. What programmers say to each other all the time is they sit up from their keyboard and they look around the room, and with this huge smile on their face, they go, "Oh, I'm an idiot." And the thing is, you have to just get this kind of weird pleasure from going, that looked like it was going to work, and here's why it was just so wrong.
Right.
That's the personality trait. That's the sort of mindset you're trying to cultivate. And I don't think I have the perfect answer for that yet. In class, when I'm with my high school students, I model this behavior because when I
Mm,
can't figure out their problem right away, I just express to them how cool that is and what a great deal this is that they have something that I can't just look at and figure out, like, okay, now let's have some fun.
hmm
In my online classes, that's harder.
mm,
But one of the things I try to do is using Zoom and screen share recording. I will work through a problem, and sometimes I know what I'm going to do, and I'm doing a relatively scripted task. And sometimes I just take my heart in my hands and say, I'm going to start coding this, and you get to see all the things I do wrong. Now, in either case, even if I think I know what I'm going to do, I will type things wrong. I'll make bugs. I'll hit some problem that they hit. And then, there'll be this pause and I'll go, oh, I wonder what's wrong with that. And try to model that joy in the debugging part of the process.
yeah.
But I do think it's a mindset that people have to cultivate. And I haven't figured out the ideal way to communicate that online.
Yeah, online adds some tricky aspects to it. Like you could certainly talk about like Carol Dweck's like fixed versus growth mindset and whatnot, but online settings present interesting challenges. I too love to model my own debugging practices and like bugs that I was trying to solve. So I saw kids 4 to 5 days a week, and every Thursday, if I remember correctly, was debugging. Where at the start of it, I'd share, here's a big bug I was working on this past week, and here's how I solved it, or here's how I'm attempting to solve it.
Right.
And I would have kids like go through some debugging challenges on their own before resuming their projects.
And formally, in a formal sense, one of the techniques that I've picked up from algebra instruction is the concept of the worked example.
Mm-hmm.
So where it's not just an example, that is, you don't just show people 3 problems and then ask them to solve it. A worked example involves some sort of interaction. So you've got some code in my case, and then people have to, for example, enhance it or explain it. So my students work with a lot of code that is nearly complete or complete, but then they have to change it.
Mm-hmm.
But then also I give them worked wrong examples, which is also a concept from algebra instruction.
Yep.
And so not every week, but probably half of the weeks in any of my coding courses, as opposed to my web authoring course, my students will have code that's broken and their job is to fix it. It's really fun because like I have a smiley face exercise where I I have the code wrong in all these little tiny ways. There's like one line you have to fix,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a smiley face with one eye instead of two, or his smile is upside down. And students just really love that. They
Mm-hmm.
don't love the one where I can break a while statement that only has 4 or 5 lines. I can break it in 6 different ways without even trying. And they have to figure it out. And one of the things I realized is I have to make them not only fix it, but tell me what was wrong with it,
Yeah.
not only for their reflection, but also it would be easy to just copy the same code back in because the loops are all the same. But that focus and emphasis on, hey, code's broken all the time. So let's just work on our skills for fixing it. That is something I try to work formally into my classes.
Yeah, and I think new CS educators can kind of learn alongside kids when it comes to bugs they haven't come across or immediately be able to fix, and like guide through some questions. And then once it's solved, asking that, can you explain to me how this now works? What do you think was going on before? What do you think is different and whatnot? And then both people are learning.
The initiative we have where we put CS professionals in classrooms, which kind of parallels the Microsoft Teams thing.
Yep.
We invented it in parallel probably about the same time. So I go to a school district, one classroom 2 days a week. I go to Sheridan High 2 days a week. And then my colleague Mark Toney goes down to Buffalo for one block period a week. And the thing I think that we add most is that it's so easy for teachers who are using one of the online curricula, which are great. Those curricula are just wonderful. But I see teachers resorting to, let's look at the posted solution and
Yep.
compare your lines to those lines.
Yep.
And what we model and what we try to get the teachers more skilled in is the ability to not look at the posted solution, but to look at the student's code and figure out what's going wrong and some way to fix it, which may or may not end up looking like the posted code solution.
Yeah, and I really appreciate when they post like, here are several options of how you can solve this particular bug, as opposed to here's the one way to do it.
Yeah. But that's laborious to sort through.
Yeah.
And one thing teachers never have is enough time. So
Yeah. Can you tell me a story of one of your experiences in education that continues to impact you or informs what you do or don't do in the classroom?
when I was a freshman at college, I had the privilege of taking my first calculus class from a man whose name was John Kemeny. And Kemeny and Tom Kurtz were the co-inventors of BASIC. So, this was a guy he had been a math professor. They had invented the basic computer language and one of the variants of time sharing systems. And then he had become the president of the college, but he still taught one class a semester. He had the most remarkable capacity to listen to a question and perceive what you didn't understand about what he had just taught you, so that when you asked a question, you didn't get him repeating what he had said before as if you hadn't heard it.
Right.
He was able to come around to the side of the topic that you were on and explain it in a truly different way.
Hmm.
That eventually fed into, when I was a manager, I was one of those people who really liked the seven habits of highly effective people. And the one that I think is the absolute most important is seek first to understand and then only to be understood.
Hmm.
And this is very hard with all education, and particularly with the threshold concepts of computer science, to see things from the other person's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And even if I can't always do that in my presentations, I try to do that when I'm working one-on-one with students, or I'm staring at their code and trying to leave them notes that make the solution make sense from their perspective as
Yeah.
opposed from my perspective. That has always been something that I harked back to when I thought about teaching, was trying to understand the student's problem from their eyes instead of from mine. Boy, that's hard.
Yeah, but it's such a valuable approach. Having multiple perspectives and providing that in the responses can really change things. One of the questions that I have as a follow-up is, How do you encourage students to find different perspectives from resources that are not responsive? So, for example, if they find an explanation of how to do something outside of class, and let's say it's a blog post or YouTube video, they might not have the ability to actually contact the author to gain another perspective. So, how would they seek out a different answer for a solution they're looking for?
My problem is not really getting students to seek out different answers, because the internet is so full of coding solutions for everything.
Hmm.
One of the things that I do quite intentionally is try to focus students on what I think of as reliable resources. So for example, a
Hmm.
specific example. As a computer science professional, as a programmer, okay, person who actually generates code for pay, I use a site called Stack Overflow all the time.
Hmm.
But Stack Overflow is full of old material. It's full of obscure answers to edge conditions.
Hmm.
It's also the top one or two search results on almost any coding question you can ask. And I try very hard to get my students to not go to Stack Overflow as a primary resource, because they don't have the skills to understand why the answer to a question there that's a perfectly good answer to a perfectly good question is not the answer that they're seeking
Right.
to the question, the simpler question they have. So I direct them to a site like W3 Schools, which isn't question and answer, but is, at a tutorial, at a simple reference level, and try to get them to focus on doing trying to find a simple answer to a simple problem.
Hmm.
I don't know that I actually use this example in my classes, but if something, could be a zebra or a horse, assume it's a horse. It's really easy for, all of us as coders have always assumed that there must be something broken about the environment we're using because the code is clearly right. And you have to focus on the fact that your code is probably wrong, and so you're looking for a simple explanation, not an obscure one.
Yeah, and context matters.
Context does matter. I do encourage students to ask questions. Boy, that's hard for them. We use Slack
Hmm.
instead of the standard college style discussion forum as a place for students to interact with each other and with me. I'm always encouraging people. In fact, I give extra credit for people who will ask a question on Slack, because almost any student finds it a difficult thing to put out there in public in front of all the other people in a class,
Hmm.
a question that shows they don't understand something, even though it's the most valuable thing they can do for anybody else in the class,
Right.
is to admit that and ask the question. But then I was always that person who had my hand up asking the question nobody else would ask when I was in a class in person. So that hesitancy to ask questions is sort of foreign to me, and I have to just keep remembering that it's true.
So, what are some of the things that you wish you knew when you first started teaching computer science or coding?
There's some things I now know that I didn't know before. So, for example, your choice of textbook at the college level just makes an enormous difference.
Yep.
Just as at the high school level, where we're now teaching primarily with published curricula
Yep.
from, say, code.org or codehs.com or Project Lead the Way, your choice of one of those environments for learning really makes all the difference.
Yep.
We're so lucky at the high school level to have this selection of solid, really dependable, well thought out curricula. And then within that, one of the things I do in my college classes that I kind of wish the high school curricula did a little bit more of, I will, through the course of my 15 weeks, take 2 or 3 problems, and we do something super primitive with those problems in the first 3 weeks, and then in the middle part of the section we'll do an advanced version. So for example, I use this textbook that's intended to be a self-study book for my COSI 1010, and in the course of the semester they build 3 different versions of a battleship game, and pretty uniformly by the time they build the last one they've really impressed themselves. And in my web authoring class, they do an exercise where they create a national park page like about week 2, I think. And then over the course of the semester, they do more. And by the time they do the last one, they've done a responsive grid or flex styled, CSS styled version of the same page. And they just love that they can see their own progress,
Hmm.
and they look at what seemed so hard and obscure at the beginning. And now that's the easy part. And the message should be, okay, you're always going to be learning something, so that the old stuff is the simple part, and the stuff that was so hard 3 weeks ago, now seems like, oh, well, that was trivial. Now this is really hard.
Right.
And that's the programmer's journey.
Right.
When I worked with people, when I mentored young programmers, the phrase I always used is, if your old code isn't embarrassing you, then you're really not working hard enough, because you're not growing fast enough. Because the purpose of old code is to just make you blush, because you'll know such a better way to do it now.
Yeah, and I think that like I believe you phrase it as the coder's journey. I think that's also like an educator's journey as well. Just
Oh,
if the way that you taught 5 years ago versus the way you teach now, it should be very different. You should just constantly be growing and whatnot.
yes, and I have this experience coming up where, don't tell them this, but I have a couple of students in my COSI 1030 class, which is the C++ compiled language class this spring, who took the previous class more than 2 years ago. One of them took it from me, one of them took it from somebody else a year earlier, and both of them are, I worry about those two students versus the people who've now taken my COSI 1010, because we do such a better job of
Hmm.
teaching the introductory class now, and it's so much more substantial than it was when we began our teaching journey 2 years ago for me, and 3 or 4 for Mark. That it'll be interesting to see how those students do. At least they're both local to me, so I could have them come in, and if they need extra tutoring, I just happen to be lucky that they're both here in Sheridan County, where they could get to my school if they need to. But yes, old course curriculum also embarrass one.
So you mentioned the beginning of the teaching journey. I'm curious, if you were to lose your memory and you had to relearn CS and you had to relearn how to code and how to teach, like where would you start and how would you try and regain your mastery in those areas?
That's such a difficult question for me, because I have programmed for so long. Even though my teaching journey, my formal teaching journey is very short. I actually did my first programming in probably almost 50 years ago. That's how long I've done it. So I'd like to change the question a little bit
Hmm.
and focus on what things prepare you to learn how to code.
Yeah.
And to me, you can't do anything better for yourself, or maybe for your kids, if you want them to be good technologists, than simply have them build and make things. I mean, if you think about it, coding is making things with your mind, but you have to be able to do things like understand that the order in which you do things makes a huge difference,
Hmm.
and that clarity of thought and directions and writing makes a huge difference. I think of coding as communication. I think if I was going to spend 5 years on a desert isle trying to get ready to take a coding class when I got off it, I'd weave baskets. I would build nets. I don't know. I would do anything that had process to it. When I look back on my sort of childhood, I spent a lot of time doing things like, if we bought a cart, I'd assemble it, or the barbecue, or figure out how to just put things together and how they work. And there's so much real world debugging to do,
Yeah.
particularly in this day and age, where in general it tends to be, put your kid in charge of getting the new router set up and dealing with the completely obscure instructions, because they have so much more to gain from going through the process, and you have so much to gain by offloading that time consuming, frustrating experience to somebody else. That just always let the young person around you do some of this, as long as they can explain to you why it works. which is an important thing. You need to get them to explain to you what happened.
Yeah.
I don't know about learning computer science. I think it is like learning anything that is process and product oriented. The more different other process and product things, I mean, whether you've baked or you've sewn or you've welded or you do carpentry, I was a fiber person. So I taught myself how to crochet. I taught myself how to weave. I taught myself how to do needlepoint. And boy, do those things apply to computer science
Hmm.
because it's all about patterns and on off and colors. And I don't know, it's just the parallels between fiber arts and coding. Well, they go back as far as the jacquard loom, but they work really well together.
So, what advice might you give for people who are struggling to find integration examples in other subject areas? Because you've already mentioned multiple.
She's only part-time right now, but we have an educator who is an employee of the college, but does nothing but work with K-5 classrooms doing integration.
Mhm.
And integration is so important because so many topics now and increasingly in the future are data driven. So I think any kind of data analysis that you can work into another class. There's a lot of stuff in the science curriculums about collecting data, but oftentimes you collect very small amounts of data because you're assuming your students have to do any kind of math by hand. And I think to the extent that science teachers or math teachers can begin to integrate, for example, spreadsheets where you can work in, you can teach somebody what the calculation is, but then suddenly they can download a data set with maybe 1,000 entries in it,
Right.
and for the same amount of work, get a really interesting analysis of some real world data. There's just so much real world data out there. The hard part is choosing it.
Right.
And the same is true with social science topics. In my COSI 1010 class, I have a couple of exercises that are based on Native American census data.
Hmm.
At some point you have to sum, average, and look at mins and maxes. And so for that, I use Native American population data from the US Census across states. And one of the things that jumps right out at you is that the populations are not where you think they are.
Mhm.
That in fact, there's the substantial populations are in states like Oklahoma and New York, as opposed to Wyoming and Montana.
Hmm.
And the thing is, that could all be done in a spreadsheet. We happen to do it with JavaScript, but you could look at those same numbers very easily, and that data is all available. And then you can also work in the obligatory conversation about how badly the US Census data actually represents Native American populations for a couple of different reasons.
Mhm.
So so even though I'm only teaching the computer science, I've been striving each semester to find examples that have nothing to do with computer science. They have to do with the world.
Right.
And I think that can be done at every grade level.
Yeah.
I have a difference with some of my computer science colleagues. I personally think spreadsheets are great programming environments and great places for people to do data analysis. Real scientists often use spreadsheets for preliminary data analysis or data cleanup. And I know that social scientists do. And so the fact that it doesn't look like programming to some people doesn't mean that you're not understanding, the order you have to apply the operations, or you're not
Right.
having to debug the spreadsheet when it's not coming out right. And so I really encourage people to find data sets and analyze them, and, analyzing them in Google Sheets or in Excel, whatever you have available in your school district. I think that's a great way to do things.
Yeah, and we even previously talked about sonifying data. I'm wondering if you could potentially share what that sounds like or what that is.
What it sounds like. One of the interesting computer science sort of fields of research and development over the last decade or so has been utilizing the fact that the human ear can distinguish patterns and gradations of difference at a much higher level than the eye can. What that means is that you take data you've collected digitally, so it ends up being a set of numbers. And instead of trying to do a visualization where you try to make a graph or you try to make a pie chart out of something, you find a way to sonify it, that is, turn it into sound. And that can be kind of resonifying. So, for example, you can collect earthquake data, and then instead of presenting it as some kind of visualization, you turn it back into wave form, but in as sound waves as opposed to earth waves. It turns out that the trained ear can hear differences in data and be able to distinguish between types of earthquakes, for example, simply by hearing them in a way that seeing that data either as numbers or seeing it as some other kind of visualization wouldn't allow you to do. And I'm still struggling with finding ways to work sonification into my classroom practice.
Hmm.
It isn't that the libraries are out there. I just haven't found an example that's you can fit into a week.
Right.
But, we know this, that trained physician can diagnose different kinds of heart ailments simply based on the sound of the valves. And so the idea is to try to take that skill that's inherent in the human and provide that particular sense with data that needs analysis. And I'm really intrigued by that. I think it's a growing field, but I'm still struggling with a way to work it into the classroom, that, my classroom and my 1 week lessons.
Yeah, and if this sounds too abstract for like elementary teachers, this is something that can be done with young kids, whether it's in Sonic Pi or even something like Scratch. Like an easy example is you could take stock market price of a specific stock and assign it to a MIDI note. So when it's $100, assign it to MIDI note 100. When it's $101, assign it to 101. Or you can get into more complicated stuff with like multiple variables. So like assign certain notes to the cholesterol level and then other notes to like blood pressure, and just like going to different parts of health and then listening back to that and going, okay, well, how is this person's health data changing over time? And what are
Mhm.
some of the incidents that are impacting when it sounds very different from other moments?
Mhm. And one of my favorite example sites that I usually do show students various points is the site that sonifies Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
Wikipedia makes a live stream of the data about changes being made available. And there's a site that turns that into both sound and visualization, so that you'll hear one tone when a new user is created on Wikipedia,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll hear another tone when an article is edited, and a third kind of tone when new article is created. And then there's a certain amount of volume information that codifies, like, for example, how large a change. And it's just, I just turn it on and listen to Wikipedia being changed. It's great. It's great white noise. It's a beautiful sound, but it is random and musical at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the CS educators that I know don't have experience in CS as a professional. There are a few people who do, like yourself and like Sandy and Sarah, but some of the people that I've interviewed on the show. But I'm wondering, what are some of the things that you wish that CS educators knew about computer science as a profession? And how might that understanding kind of change the way we approach CS education?
It's an interesting question, because I think as soon as an educator starts teaching computer science, they begin to appreciate the fact that it is a skill and a practice, not a topic. But if I was going to try and convey that message to someone, I would convey it to school board members and the PTSB and the folks who manage, I guess it's the Board of Education, who manage the curriculum process,
Mm-hmm.
standards process, because I think one of the things that people have to appreciate, and that teachers in particular need support for, is that this is a topic like teaching that's a journey, and that the field is always changing out from under us.
Yep.
Our ability to understand it grows, and then it shrinks when we don't practice for a while, and then we have to get back into practice. And that, unlike math, say, it's not going to be the same 5 years from now that it is now. So, for example, in my COSI 1010 class, I have a week on events. And when I learned computer science so many years ago, regular human programmers didn't really deal with events. You had to be a sysprog to have to worry about having your code interrupted by some kind of user input. And now it's like I drive down the highway at 70 miles an hour and it seems perfectly simple to me, but 80 years ago it would have seemed impossible on 2 or 3 levels for me to be going down a road 80 miles an hour and be in control. Well,
Hmm.
computer science education changes faster than that.
Right.
What we need to teach, how we need to integrate with other things need to change. And I think the teachers have very little trouble appreciating that. I think the folks who are trying to find those teachers and get them to take on a new class and, oh well, you find this online curriculum and then you'll be able to teach it, or the administrators who want to just, or even the legislature. I love the fact that our state legislature mandated computer science education K through 12, but I don't think they appreciate the ongoing struggle that's going to present in terms of teachers keeping up with the field
Hmm.
and then trying to push integration down to the K through 5 for things that, and into the other classes. I mean, we know, for example, that science is done only partially in a test tube anymore. So at University of Wyoming, biology majors are required to take a computer science class, COSI 1010. And I believe that's going to be true of every science. The single most self-taught topic for PhD students now is programming. PhD students of any discipline, but particularly science disciplines, if they didn't know coding when they started their PhD, they find they have to teach it to themselves.
Yep.
The teachers seem to appreciate the fact that their topic is going to change all the time and they're going to keep having to have education. This isn't a topic. It's not US history, to 1910. It's a skill that both the teachers and the students have to maintain, and that is also the education of it's going to change all the time. If there's one factoid that people should know about, okay, as opposed to sort of a mindset people should have, it's that current employment data says that almost no matter what professional job you have right now or you're trying to get, if you can show that you also know how to program and or do effective data analysis with some of the tools like R or MATLAB or whatever, not only are your job prospects better, but your salary prospects are much higher. And that we need to be making sure that people understand computer science isn't just for programmers anymore, that computer science is going to drive virtually all science and science developments, and then many of the social sciences. So yes, history research, you're still going to go out and a certain amount of it's going to be reading old tomes, but then you're also going to do a lot of data based analysis of documents and things like that. So, that's probably the thing that administrators and other teachers need to know, not the computer science teachers, is how central probably programming and data analysis are becoming in every field in the modern age.
Yeah, and to jump onto your mentioning computer science as a skill, it's a skill and a literacy. So like administrators who are mandating things and like, oh, we only have to teach computer science for like 30 minutes a month or a quarter or whatever. It's like, okay, but if you were trying to have kids learn English, but they could only speak it, read it, and engage in it for 30 minutes a month, they're not going to do it by the end of their K-12 tenure.
The example Mark Tony always uses is about playing an instrument
Right.
or painting. Yes, you can paint by number and produce something that looks okay, but you're not really able to paint. That takes practice. It takes teaching your brain how to see in a different way. And the same with music. You can hit a button on a player piano and it's making music, but that's not really learning how to play. It takes application, it takes practice, it takes being willing to be wrong and try over and over again. And that's a really good model, I think, for programming. So you get out of practice quickly. It's
Hmm.
remarkable if you don't code for a few months and you go back and look at it, just it takes a while to warm back up again.
Yeah, and so You'd mentioned Wyoming support, and we met for the Wyoming's CS Standards Review Committee. I'm wondering, how did you get involved with the committee, and what are some of the things that you kind of learned in that process in terms of how states are supporting computer science in Wyoming?
One of the school district administrators that I work with on a regular basis sent out an email call to people sort of who were involved. So the public school teachers I was working with, computer science faculty at my college, and said, please sign up to be on this committee. I think the committee selection is based partly on geography and partly on trying to get a wide selection of different points of view. And so 3 of us from Sheridan County were selected. There was a person from industry, a public school teacher, and me from a community college. And I had absolutely no idea what I was getting in for. But it was it was an interesting experience. It was a worthwhile experience. It'll be interesting to see how this standard rolls out.
Yeah.
When I heard the process was one of consensus and that we were a group of 40 people, I almost didn't show up. As much as I like to get people to agree, I've always been a sort of a lead from the front kind of person, and that somebody eventually has to be the person who the buck stops and you make the decision. So the concept that we could find some way that 40 people at a time would agree on these little tiny detailed, tidbits of text just struck me as insane. And yet, given the right organization, given people of goodwill, given time and patience and the relationships we built, it's not a perfect document, but I think we did a great job. And even when we were sent back by the Board of Education for a rather painful review to try and come up with some change or some trimming of the document to make it more digestible.
Mm-hmm.
It was such a remarkable group of people who were all trying to do the right thing together. I was really impressed.
Yeah, both in terms of the processes that we went through, like the discussions we had, but then the overall end product. I think it was good.
Yes, it really was. And it was interesting the different roles that people played. I mean, you came at it with a big background in pedagogy and sort of pedagogical theory.
Mm-hmm.
The classroom teachers we had in our subgroup were absolutely essential in terms of saying, sure, but here's the way it is in the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
and this is what works in Wyoming. And here's the situation in a school with, only 80 kids in K through 12. And, they brought real truth. And some of us, really stood up for, no, you have to deal with packets, for
Mm-hmm.
example, when you're talking about networks, because it's like the atomic theory, you know, messages are made out of little parts and they have to get reassembled. And so we each took up a role, but nobody took up a hardened stance. And
Right.
we eventually, with enough patience, came to a lot of, I think, important agreements. I certainly appreciated the fact that you were another person who really cared about the wordsmithing,
Yeah.
because I think in the end, you not only need to agree on what you're trying to say, you need to make the words say that.
Right.
And there's a level of patience in trying to make the words say what you mean. Again, it was just everybody was contributing in different places, and that's a place where you and I think, built some common ground.
Yeah, because like you have to think through, okay, what are we intending? What's the best case scenario? But what's also the worst case scenario of this wording?
Right. One of the biggest takeaways I took away from the standard is I didn't know much about what the documents were like. I didn't know much about the overall process. I believe that as a group, one of the things that concerned us about the overall process is that the normal cycle in Wyoming for reviewing standards documents is 9 years. And there are 2 reasons why that should probably not apply to the document we produced. One is the topic. As I said before, this is an area where things are changing very fast all the time. And the other is it was a first draft. And I think we all agree that when our standard is in practice in classrooms, people are going to find places where it needs to be changed. So I'm really hoping the state of Wyoming can make an exception for that document and probably put it on a 5-year cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the cycle for reviewing it is over a year, so you can't do it too often. But I don't think it should be every 9 or 10 years. It really just is too long.
Yeah, and when we initially created the first draft and sent it to the for public review, there was some pushback in that there's hesitancy about whether these were even doable with in particular, like the K2 and the K5 group.
Right.
There's just this fear of, well, we don't have enough time. We're now having to add in yet another subject area onto our plates in a packed school day. I'm wondering what kind of advice you might give for any of the teachers who are looking at some of the computer science standards or just computer science in general who are hesitant about it.
My advice is to try and turn that around a little bit. As I mentioned before, here in Sheridan County, we have a educational trainer who's working with the K through 5 grades, whose job is specifically to work on integration. And the idea that she's pursuing, her background is, I think, as a second grade teacher. So she's a very recent classroom teacher. She knows the people she's working with. She's respected by them. And her message and the materials she's providing is to not in any way treat the computer science curriculum as an additional topic that should be taught separately, except for maybe just some very, very minor parts of it, that in fact, everything about it should be used to integrate with other topics and enhance the teacher's ability to educate the students in those areas. So for example, she's using Scratch Junior to help them not only meet the upcoming computer science standards, but to enhance their language arts skill.
Mm-hmm.
One of the skills students need to demonstrate is that they understand sequence and that they can put a story together and tell it in a way where it makes sense in order. And if you're using Scratch Junior, for example, to create that story, the student's experience is very enhanced because it's not just words on a piece of paper, it's an illustrated story. But they still have to get the basic skill down of being able to decide what happens first, what happens second, and be logical about it. I'm hoping that the computer science curriculum can almost disappear into the other curriculum areas, except for those few areas we marked that need to be assessed separately. The skills enhance other areas. They shouldn't have to detract a lot from the classroom instruction in other areas. Now, that's a very idealized college teacher, parenty kind of way to say that. My feet are not on the ground in K through 5, but that's certainly the hope.
Yeah, and I think 10 years from now, this conversation will be much easier to do because teachers who are going to come out of colleges of education over the next few years are going to likely have some experience with computer science and are going to see models of ways of implementing it. But right now, there's the issue of, well, how do we get the professional development for all those teachers and how do we do certification and other forms of support? So I'm wondering what you think the state in particular could do to kind of further assist with this process to get to that idealized version of CS in K-12?
I don't know what it can do, what states in general can do. I can speak a little bit to what Wyoming is doing and the clarification that has come down. So it's interesting. I work with classroom educators, mainly 6th grade and above, and I teach classroom educators in my classes. They have begun voluntarily over the last couple of years going ahead and signing up for classes, even though they weren't sure what the credentialing picture would be. And I find that their questions are much more often to me about credentialing. So this used to leave me feeling very helpless, but I have tried to understand the credentialing picture as it's developed in Wyoming. For classroom teachers who are adding the computer science curriculum to their integrated K through 5 classroom instruction, they don't need any additional credentialing, which doesn't mean they don't need additional training. Our school district was somewhat ahead of some other school districts in terms of implementing a lot of computer science stuff anyway. And so we're trying to stay sort of on the leading edge. And I certainly hope that the school district will share some of that wisdom and experience with other people around the state in trainings and presentations and that kind of stuff. But for either pull out special teachers or for any teacher of computer science 6 through 12, in our state over the course of the next few years, those teachers are supposed to get a computer science endorsement. And there's been a lot of misunderstanding about that. There, unfortunately, like my field as a whole, there are many different things going on at once. A lot of good work is being done, but on different timescales. And so one of the things that's been confusing is that there are some things that are being talked about now that probably aren't going to be ready for a few years. And then there are a few things that are being talked about that are ready right now and that teachers and school districts can go ahead and start on.
Hmm.
So, for example, in what for them is rather lightning speed, the Professional Teaching Standards Board last spring reworked the computer science endorsement requirements for computer science teachers, so effectively 6 through 12, and went from a 27 credit endorsement down to a 15 credit endorsement that could specifically be delivered, all those 15 credits could specifically be delivered by community colleges. So they really tried to step up, I think, to making the credentialing, the endorsement more achievable and achievable more locally.
Yeah, and some of the difficulties that credentialing institutions have kind of got into, or just credentialing in general, were sometimes offering classes to teachers that are great for your undergraduate CS major, but really don't have a lot of relevance to somebody who's teaching computer science in an integrated manner to a kindergartner. So yeah, you might be learning like the basics of how to construct a program in like an IDE like Eclipse or something, but you're never going to use that with your K through 2 kids.
Right. And that's where I think, what I haven't heard in Wyoming is because those K through 5 teachers don't need an additional credential.
Hmm.
What I haven't heard is a statewide approach to the professional development that they need.
Hmm.
I think that integration in the classroom is very tricky. It's really critical because it's now declared to be out of the credentialing pathway. I do have some concern that that might make it ignored when in fact in some ways it's the harder and more critical problem. I mean,
Right.
what we've said all along here in Sheridan County is, we're firing on all cylinders and we're rolling out computer science education and rolling it down to the elementary level. We're going to have an ongoing problem that as students get to the high school, suddenly the classes that worked 2 years ago don't work anymore because they already know that stuff. And we're seeing that. I mean, we have this problem that we have sophomores taking what would have been a senior year class
Hmm.
and their final experience in computer science at our high school, well, they're taking it as a sophomore now. And so suddenly, and maybe their junior year is filled up with their classes, but by senior year, they're ready to take another programming class. And so we've had to add yet another AP class on top of that. And that's the problem you want to have is for the skill set coming up through the elementary levels to be driving high school teachers to distraction in terms of always having to move their practice farther up the evolutionary scale. But I do worry about how that's being rolled out, particularly in the smaller school districts. Now, WDE, the Wyoming Department of Education, has an effort funded somewhat by a Microsoft grant, maybe fully by a Microsoft grant, to try to work with all school districts and help them plan and help, I hope, there to be some amount of consistent approach to rolling out the elementary level. Do you know, I would think, this isn't, like you said, this isn't teaching computer science. This is teaching computer science integration in the elementary classroom. Is there a is there an accepted curriculum for that? Are there online programs for teachers to get professional development in that area? Is there even a certification or a degree for that?
I'm not aware of any certifications or degrees. There are a lot of people who are approaching it in different ways. Like in the PD that we do, we can't possibly go in and find examples in every subject area for every standard for every state that we're working in.
Right.
So what we like to do is, okay, here are some examples of projects, and here are some examples of how you could potentially integrate these projects, but now let's kind of unpack how it relates to the standards that you are working with,
Mhm.
and let's kind of create our own lesson plans related to this, and so that way you can integrate it into your classroom and use it tomorrow if you wanted to. But that's just kind of one approach.
Right, 'cause that's one of the things I always forget about you is that you're not just, you don't do that much or any teaching of computer science directly yourself. you're in a company that's trying to provide just the kind of professional development I was just talking about, right?
Yeah, and yeah, like I used to be in the classroom doing it was K-8 coding classes, but now I'm at the nonprofit doing all the professional development stuff and curriculum.
Right. And so you probably have a much better perspective on how counties in Wyoming and school districts and states around the nation are trying to tackle that integration
Hmm.
problem, which I think can be done so well, but but is labor intensive. I think students could benefit from it being done well. They could benefit so much, but I just don't see it. It isn't computer science taking away from the classroom experience of the student. It's the burden it puts on the teacher to figure out the integration that enhances the student experience. That does seem like a hard problem to solve over the next few years.
Yeah, and really well in what way? So like there are districts that I know of who are claiming that they're doing computer science for all or coding for all and like look at all these wonderful things we're doing, but then when you actually look at it in practice, they are spending like 30 minutes a quarter on it. And it's like, well, okay, just because you spend 30 minutes a quarter on it, it doesn't mean you're really diving deep into the stuff. So the quality of what you're doing is not enough.
Right.
So you mentioned that multiple times, like CS just being a skill that's constantly changing and whatnot, and that adds pressures onto, like you said before, some of the high school teachers who are like, okay, well now what was a senior class is now going to be like an entry level class, and I need to create more content for those upper divisions. Education in general has a really high kind of like dropout or burnout rate. I'm wondering what advice you might have or how you kind of take care of yourself to kind of prevent that kind of burnout when you're in a field that's just constantly changing and asking more from you.
I mean, that's my whole career is
Hmm.
even though I'm doing it in teaching now, there are two things about me. I've always worked in a field that was changing out from under me. And programmers don't usually burn out because they get tired of doing what they've done. Programmers as professionals quit the profession, I believe, primarily because what they knew 2 years ago isn't worth much now, and they have to go through that whole learning experience over and over again. I like to learn. In fact, it's probably the only thing I'm actually good at. I've never been super topic obsessed, or I'm a good writer, I think, an editor, but otherwise I don't have a super skill in one area. I'm not a real conventional programmer in the sense of, just like diving deep into one particular technology. I like to learn. And so the field of programming, of coding, of technology has always worked for me because I don't have to do anything for too long. I can just always be starting over again. And I think teaching is like that. You have to suck up and deal with the fact that, you're always refining, you're always creating, you're always having to add something new. But it also keeps things interesting. I'm one of those people who puts a lot of stress on myself, so I'm always stressed. My solution to that is to try really hard to find one day a week that I actually take off
Hmm.
and to either get outside or to make something or do something. So, digging in the garden, teaching myself slowly how to sew, making something beautiful
Hmm.
is just a fix for many ills. And, once or twice a year we go on vacation and we completely unplug.
Nice.
I'll be out in a place that not only has no cell connection, it has no electricity, it has nothing. For me, I think that's really, really critical, is to just get totally away. And usually, in the outdoor stuff, do something that's kind of scary, because there's something about being scared that really like makes you focus on the moment instead of thinking about like what you have to do when you get back.
Yeah, I think essentially hitting the F5 to refresh is a valuable thing to do throughout the year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard though, especially when you have a lot of deadlines and
Yeah, it is hard. But I've also changed career. I mean, I've been in the same field, but I've also completely changed careers
Mhm.
twice now. That gives it a certain freshness.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. What do you wish there was more research on that might inform what you do in the class?
I'm going to say something kind of embarrassing. I don't know if I wish for more research or if I wish for more time to read the research there is.
Mm.
When I do find time to go looking for research, I always learn something.
Hmm.
Like several years ago, I tried to start a business and get a government grant to do it, to write a math teaching app, and found a whole body of literature on different ways to teach algebra and what's effective and what's not, and came up with this concept out of there of the worked example.
Hmm.
One small thing like that can inform and shape your practice for a long time.
Yeah.
So I think it is interesting that even to this date, the computer science community cannot decide how to teach computer science, what to teach in what order, and in particular, what are introductory topics and what are not. So, I do occasionally go out and I look to see what other people are writing about how you teach computer science. And what I see is a community that has essentially no agreement. There's a document that comes out every, I don't know, 5 or 10 years from I think it's the Association of Computing Machinery, about computer science teaching practices. And it just keeps getting longer and longer because there just is a longer and longer list, and they have syllabi from now probably 25 different institutions, and none of them are the same.
Hmm.
I don't wish there was more agreement, but it is a disincentive to spend much time reading when, as far as I can tell, we're all making it up as we go along. Because that's how I program, that doesn't bother me as much as it bothers some other people. In one of your questions, someplace there's a line about, what advice would you give somebody who is starting to teach computer science? And
Hmm.
as much as your teaching 2 years ago is always going to embarrass you, it's better to start and observe the results and give your students access, because really you're not teaching, you're letting them learn. And if, a year from now, a better way to present something than you did to this year's students, you still gave them the chance to learn this on their own, because like any other skill or practice, it's every bit as much what they put into it and what they bring to it as anything you can give them, except the opportunity.
Yeah, and your point about like finding the time to read the research, that's one of the reasons why this podcast alternates between an interview on one week and then the next week I kind of talk about scholarship relevant to CS education, because I'm aware it's very hard for people not only to find time for sitting down and reading, but also even just getting access to research, because there's like that paywall to get to it. So I'm hoping that this podcast helps with that. What are some questions that I have not asked that you might want to discuss?
Besides learning from my own practice and trying to observe, I really don't know where and how to find the time to identify the ideas and the influencers that I should be learning from.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. I mean, you can find stuff like TED Talks of people who talk about education. Ken Robinson's, I think, is still the most watched one, and that one's on education and creativity.
That's the guy who talks about the factory model.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen him. He's good.
Yeah, even like just in your day to day. So, like, I, for a couple of years, took Muay Thai classes, and the people who were teaching the classes didn't have any kind of background in education, but the way they taught how to fight and defend yourself was phenomenal. The pedagogy that they were using, it was really well done. And like,
Mhm.
I went in and was just shocked at how good they were as educators. And so I took some of what they were doing and was going, oh, I can apply that pedagogical approach in my class. Obviously not the fighting part, not the content, but like the how they approach like teaching somebody something. So even the day to day, you can
Yeah.
find people who are doing good things.
Well, and that's the other piece that I didn't mention about the chance to go into the high school classes, is that there is so much to be learned from an experienced master teacher in her own classroom.
Yep.
They don't they probably don't think they're doing much, but
Right.
they just are doing so much, and then to add a second classroom and see the difference, the things that are working, the difference in the students, the difference in the behaviors in the classroom and the progress the students are making on exactly the same curriculum. It's amazing what a difference the teacher makes.
Mm-hmm.
So I do pay attention to the folks around me, but boy, it's just, you're like putting a spoon down into the fire hose and trying to get some water out. It's just amazing.
Where might people go to connect with you or the organizations you work with?
I'm always available at Sheridan.edu. If you go to Sheridan.edu and in the search bar, you type in Gunn, Gunn, I'm the only one there. Or you can look through the website and find the computer science department and find me that way. My email is egunn@Sheridan.edu because my formal first name is Elizabeth, even though I've always been called Anne. And IT systems seem to have lost the ability to be flexible in that way. So my email address is egunn@Sheridan.edu, which is pretty simple. I do present. I'm almost always happy to present. As Jared now knows from talking to me for a couple of hours, I like to talk and I like to present. We have some outreach materials that we've used to explain programming to adults for them to get a little more comfortable with what we would eventually teach students. I've done some presentations with either hands-on programming or talking about our approach. So yeah, I'm available for presentations. Anybody wants me to come and speak, I'd be happy to do that. I don't know if I'm at the forefront. I think I'm in the fight and making some decent progress. And it'd be great to share that information with other people.
And to access all of those resources that we mentioned throughout the podcast, such as Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk, information on growth mindset by Carol Dweck, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, etc., you can find those in the show notes in the description or by visiting jaredoleary.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you consider sharing with somebody else. Next week, I will be unpacking some scholarship, and the week after that, I will be interviewing somebody else for this podcast. Hope you all have a great week.